Echo Fighters have been a constant presence in every Smash game, and they've always had a pretty divisive reputation among the fandom for either being uninspired, lazy duplicates to fill up character slots, or nuanced ways to enjoy a playstyle. Whatever the justification, there's a recurring trend when it comes to Echoes in Smash. They're usually, I say usually, not always, downgraded versions of their originals when it comes to competitive success. In 64, Luigi was considered the worst character in the game, and he was a semi-clone of Mario. Jigglypuff was also noticeably worse than Kirby and was a clone of him. Occasionally the dynamic would take place in reverse, but more often than not, the original would be superior to the clone, making it all the more jarring when said original performs worse than the knockoff, and even more jarring when their movesets are quite literally identical barring one singular aspect. If you spend any amount of time following Smash Ultimate, you'll know what the greater community's viewpoint on Marth is, a fighter who for 3 straight installments dating back to his debut in Melee was consistently ranked in the upper hierarchy of the game's meta, has become the emblematic example of someone with all the tools necessary to find a spot in top tier once again, only to have all of that ruined because of circumstance. Mark has to be arguably the most tragic veteran in Smash Ultimate, and for today's episode of Why No One Plays, we're gonna find out why. If I were to be succinct about the whole thing, to save your time, yes, the reasons I'll be listing for why it's unpopular are almost guaranteed to match what you're currently thinking, but I implore you to stay and watch this all the way through. Because it's one thing to know what the problem is, it's another to know how and why it's a problem, as to me, it explains why there's such a massive gap in tier placement between Marth and Lucina, but it doesn't necessarily excuse it. Marth was the character who trailblazed an entire new archetype that has quickly become one of the largest in Smash, the Sword Fighter. A character who instead of battling out with punches, kicks, what have you, chooses to, quite pragmatically I might add, fight with a weapon, in this case a sword. Naturally, this gives his attacks more extended range compared to an unarmed fighter, and more importantly, the property of being disjointed, since any attacks that collide with the sword don't deal damage to the wielder, while punching a sword ought to be rather painful. Due to this, sword fighters excel at playing the mid-range. While their attacks are regarded as melee in nature, their farther area coverage and disjointed hitboxes give them a noteworthy advantage against those without. Therefore, it's in your best interest to always keep your opponent far enough to where their attacks can't hit you, but close enough to where you can still hit them. Further emphasizing this is the fact that Marth in particular bears the unique property of what is now known as a tipper mechanic. The majority of his attacks have a sweet spot located at the farthest end of the sword, dealing significantly more damage and knockback to the point where many of them are among the strongest of their kind. This, however, comes with the repercussion that if you strike anywhere else on the blade, it will land a weaker hit with far less power. In essence, Marth is the swordiest swordy that ever swordy, in that it's crucial for him, more so than any other blade wielder, to follow that rule. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be too challenging to overcome, as he actually possesses arguably the best raw frame data out of any sword fighter in the game. Granted, his floaty air physics make him look rather slow, but comparing attacks to attacks, his average startup surpasses that of even Mithra or Roy. Frame 8 forward tilt, frame 6 up tilt, frame 7 down tilt, frame 10 forward smash, frame 6 down smash, frame 6 neutral air, frame 6 forward air, frame 7 back air, frame 5 up air, frame 9 down air, frame 9 side B, frame 5 up B, frame 6 counter. This guy's attack speed is on par with boxer type characters, and by extension his clone Lucina, a surprisingly easy time in ground to ground or air to air against even the fastest attackers within the cast. Complementing his uncharacteristically fast startup is the coverage of his attacks, having arguably the best overall area coverage, especially in relation to his speed. Many of his normals comprise arcing swings, letting him cover large amounts of space in any direction of his choosing at a time. With these two factors at play, Marth should have no trouble playing the spacing game, and that's how it's been for him in Melee, Brawl, and Smash 4. So what happened between 4 and Ultimate that sent him tumbling all the way down in the tier list? It's kind of hard to pinpoint due to being largely circumstantial. From Melee to Brawl, even though he lost access to his outrageous grab game and incredible ground movement through the removal of wave dashing and nerfs to dash dancing, he was indirectly compensated by the overall systems changes implemented in Brawl, such as the almost inexplicable absence of hit stun nerfing combo characters, in turn buffing stray hitters, and the slow, floatier pace of the game further benefiting his already immaculate spacing in neutral. The strength of his moveset remained in more or less the same relative position. Smash 4 initially nerfed him in many aspects, although many of them were backpedaled on in version updates to allow him to return to form. In a similar fashion to Brawl, Smash 4 was also a rather slow-paced game that worked in his favor. Smash 4, however, was also the iteration where the sword fighter archetype went from a niche one to a very prominent one, which made Marth's range advantage not as exclusive anymore with the introduction of 6 new sword fighters. Well, technically 5 new and 1 returning. Corrin, Lucina, Cloud, Robin, Shulk, and Roy. Yet even so, the game environment was still agreeable to Marth's win condition, securing him a comfortable spot at 11 out of 54. Ultimate appeared to at first echo the same approach as its predecessors, giving Marth a mixture of buffs and nerfs to his innate moveset, leaning more on the side of nerfs, but maintaining his position via changes to the game's engine. Without a doubt, Ultimate is a faster game than Brawl or Smash 4, which inherently compromises its performance, but the inclusion of dash canceling grounded attacks, improvements to his initial dash, and the reduced landing lag on aerials were a massive benefit to him and the rest of his cadre. Additionally, some adjustments given to his specials, namely Dancing Blade's new animations and the ability to angle Shield Breaker, have mildly increased the number of use cases they now have. Unfortunately, even though it feels like same old on paper, there are 3 major distinctions to his gameplay experience in this game different to prior ones that ultimately influenced the greater player base to deem him unworthy of the attention and praise he once garnered. Reason 1. Marth lost his ability to space. While it's true that Marth has been given concessions in the form of better safety on aerials and more use cases on his attacks as mentioned earlier, those changes don't provide a one-to-one compensation for the single most defining aspect of his gameplay, spacing, which has become gradually less forgiving from game to game. Mobility has been augmented across the board, making it significantly more difficult for Marth to execute his game plan. The nature of his tipper mechanic forces him to play a very defensive, keep-away playstyle, continuously maintaining the line of scrimmage between him and his opponent, as that's both where he's at his strongest and his opponent is at their weakest. The changes throughout the past 3 installments incrementally removed the many tools he had at his disposal to better force that Goldilocks zone in a manner of speaking. Movement options like wave dashing, dash dancing, and perfect pivot allowed him to position himself quickly and effectively regardless of the attempts his opponent made to break through his defenses. None of those are accessible to him in Ultimate. He still has foxtrotting, and the addition of dash canceling increases the range of his threat bubble, but range and mobility were never the priority. It was the ability to space. That's the primary contributing elements to the notorious consistency issues he's been plagued with ever since the game came out. When you ask anyone why Marth sucks, they're likely going to point out how inconsistent he is, because in contrast to Roy, whose strong hitboxes have priority, Marth's weak hitboxes have priority, meaning even if it looks like you hit your opponent with the far end of your sword, if so much as a pixel of the weak hitbox made contact with their hurtbox, they would get the weak hit, whereas for Roy, sometimes tipper attacks land the strong hit because a single pixel of the hilt hitbox made contact. That does play a big role in Marth's consistency problem, but that's how he's always been. That backwards priority was the thing in Smash 4, Brawl, and even Melee if I'm not mistaken. The only difference is that those games had physics engines that were conducive to a spacing-oriented win condition. Ultimate's physics engine, however, is not. Marth has always struggled with landing tippers at the right time. It's just that in the past he had ways to not only shuffle himself to increase the likelihood of landing a tipper, but the movement speed and capabilities of the entire roster were limited enough to make it easy for him to do so. Not to mention the fact that Ultimate is the first game in a long time where landing aerials are not only a common approach option, but arguably the most integral approach option for many characters. That's why it feels so much worse in this game. To be fair, the Balance team has progressively nerfed his moveset to make those tippers harder to land, but just as he was circumstantially buffed in previous titles, he was circumstantially nerfed in this one. And those circumstantial buffs in the past were the only thing making up for the nerfs he gradually sustained in every installment until they too were taken from him. Reason 2, most consistent aspects within his kit were removed, one of the lesser pronounced aspects of Marth's deterioration. Compounding the mental strain it takes to play him is the increased dependence on landing tipper stray hits in neutral to close out stocks as a result of him losing alternative ways to do so, chief among them being up throw, allowing him some semblance of an if all else fails do this option at higher percents. With the presence of rage being far more influential in 4, up throw would usually close out stocks around 150 depending on the opponent. It wasn't a very practical win condition to go for, and it was preferable to score kills much earlier, but at the very least it was a viable recourse in the event you failed to close out stocks before getting to that point. In Ultimate, however, his up throw and Rage's knockback enhancement were both nerfed, making it so up throw wouldn't begin to kill until around 190 or higher, far too high of a percent to be considered an effective kill throw. Another notable loss of consistency was his jab confirm. Back in Smash 4, Marth used to be able to do jab 1 into basically any of his other attacks, such as jab 1 into forward tilt, jab 1 into up tilt, and so on, not unlike how Roy's jab leads into his other moves. This provided Marth with a low-risk way to go for kills, and though there was still some degree of positioning required, landing a jab was far more elementary of a task than landing a straight hit on any of his other attacks in neutral, a privilege no longer available to him in Ultimate. Those were 2 noteworthy examples, among others, such as Dancing Blade's upward finisher being a kill at one point, or the laggier aerials making up the added shield even easier to pull off in Smash 4 than it already is in Ultimate. So while Marth was historically always dependent on spacing to land tippers, he did have a few ways to threaten a stock outside of that, whereas in this game he has virtually none. Reason 3, Marth has incongruous ranges on his attacks. All of his attacks have their own tipper ranges that make it difficult to accurately and consistently land tippers every time. With the loss of his jab kill confirms, there's no ideal range for Marth to be at in order to have the best chance to achieve a tipper, thus making it almost impossible to realistically combo tippers into more tippers. Every time I hear people say, if only Marth's tipper hitboxes had priority like Roy's hilt does, that would solve all of his consistency problems, I can't help but disagree, as that statement fails to take into account the absence of a uniform length on all of his moves. Forward tilt has a different tipper distance to forward smash, which is a different tipper distance to forward air, which is a different tipper distance to side B, despite all 4 attacks aiming horizontally in front of you. To better explain this point, let's take a look at his original counterpart Roy, who was drastically buffed in Ultimate. Calling back to the hitbox priority thing I talked about, as a consequence of his hilts taking precedence over non-hilts, Roy has a very intuitive tipper distance quote-unquote in that he has none. Obviously, some of its attacks have a more generous hilt box, as I like to call it, than others. His back air, for instance, is pretty lenient when it comes to landing the strong hit, as you can tell by looking at it. On the other hand, his forward tilt necessitates that Roy is standing practically right next to his opponents to get that dark red circle, so he also has fluctuations. That being said, because his own hurt box prevents the opponent from flying right past him, you can essentially guarantee the sweet spot every time by simply being close to your opponent. There's no such thing as too close for Roy, there's only too far. Marth doesn't have that luxury, you can either be too far or too close. Since there's no physical walls on any legal stage, Marth has no assured way to guarantee tipper into tipper, and even if there was a scenario where you can pin someone down to a wall such as Steve, and even if Marth's tipper hitboxes had priority, he still has incongruous tipper ranges on his attacks, so not even in the most ideal conditions can you land constant tippers. A noteworthy kill confirm Marth has is a landing aerial into forward smash, either nair 1 or down air. When executed correctly, he straight up gets away with murder. Like seriously, I died at freaking 45. Even Roy can't kill that early. But just because you land fair 1 or down air doesn't mean you're guaranteed to land a tipper forward smash. In fact, it's extremely unlikely that you will. I know it was a while back, but in my Why No One Plays Sora video, I mentioned how Sora can only achieve nair loops if he lands a very specific hitbox on his nair, and can't perform it if he hits any of the other ones. That's Marth's entire existence. Even if you land your combos, they don't lead into tippers. It feels almost luck-based in all honesty. And what's the #1 source of frustration when it comes to video games? Lack of agency, or in layman's terms, things that are out of your control. This is particularly why Lucina feels so much more intuitive. While she may not kill anywhere near as early as Marth, she at least has a guaranteed result, letting you formulate a cohesive game plan based on expected results. If you land nair 1 or down air into forward smash, it will produce the same results every time no matter where you're standing, since forward smash covers every possible distance that nair 1 or down air can cover. Therefore, Lucina has congruous hitboxes. Furthermore, the strength of her attacks is equal to the weighted average of Marth's. So for the sake of argument, if Marth ranges from 50% to 125% power, Lucina hovers at 100 instead of the average of those two numbers being 87.5%. In other words, her performance was balanced under the assumption that you land more tippers than you don't. But anyone who plays Marth will know that's almost impossible, hence why Lucina is played more often than her ancestor. In totality, what makes Marth feel significantly worse in this game despite having some of the best balance of frame data, area coverage, and flexible pressure tools is that up until now, the conditions were always in his favor. The prior game's physics engines and movement options afforded to characters were conducive to his objective. Ultimate is the first title where that isn't the case. Contrary to popular belief, buffing him to where, say, his tipper hitboxes would have priority over non-tippers wouldn't really make a difference in people's perception of him. It would cause a few otherwise non-tipper hits to now be tippers, but there are so many circumstantial elements at play that hinder his experience. That can't just be fixed by making his tipper hitboxes bigger, the entire game would have to change. With all that said though, I don't think he deserves to be that low on the tier list. Marth is no longer a top tier threat like he used to be, but I'd be hard pressed to call him a low mid tier. That's a bit harsh of an evaluation to make, although I understand why people saw fit to put him there. Anyways, that's gonna be it for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you have, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.